Tristan Fischer, wonderful to see you. Thanks for coming in.
Good to see you too.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, Tristan is founder, group CEO of Fischer Farms.
That's right.
Full disclosure, I have been working with Tristan for a number of years now. Up until recently, I was the chairman of Fischer Farms for 4.5 years or four
That's
and a
right.
bit years. And one of the reasons I got involved in the whole business of Fischer Farms and vertical farming was because of you, Tristan. But let's talk more about that and your whole entrepreneurial journey, because I think
Great.
that's what we're here about.
My family are Canadian, and I went to university in the UK, and so I was unable to get sort of any kind of funding for it. And so what happened was that during the holiday times, I would always be working, but I always need to work in jobs which actually paid quite a lot of money. So I couldn't get a job which was just like working in a cafe or anything like that. It was actually money which was able to pay for my fees and pay for my accommodation and stuff like that. I was doing my degree at a time when Japan was in the ascendancy. I was doing Japanese oriental studies at Cambridge. And so there were quite a lot of Japanese banks in London who thought, okay, we need somebody who understands Japanese. We'd like to hire you and give you a job. And so most of the time that I was at Cambridge, I was working in some kind of financial institution. And between my third year and my fourth year at Cambridge, I basically ran out of money. And I did a deal with Cambridge, and I basically said, I have no money. I can't afford to live or pay the fees or anything like that. Can I take a year out? And I took a year out, and I spent half the year with Citibank in London doing their project finance. And then I spent the remaining 6 months in Tokyo working with a Mercury Asset Management, which was a sort of big fund.
So in some way, that was your first entrepreneurial experience. Needs must.
It was definitely a needs must. And then I came back, and then during my final year at Cambridge, Citibank was absolutely fantastic. They just basically let me go into the office and do my revision and paid me. And so I kind of got into the corporate world simply because they were the ones who were able to pay the way through it. I was at an age where the internet was starting to emerge. All these internet companies are being set up. These guys are no more special than we are. And it's like, if they can do it, why can't we have a shot at this as well? And we set up this business, which was called Mutual Enterprise, which was working about how we could take a lot of the functionality that you get in a large corporate and basically provide it to small businesses. I think probably one of the key lessons in entrepreneurialism is about timing. And so we left Citi at the end of 1999, and at that stage, a lot of these internet companies were sort of getting, $1 billion valuations for really doing not much at all. And we thought to ourselves, yeah, this is really easy.
I'll have a bit of that.
We're going to be worth at least $1 billion, if not two, by kind of the end of the year. And then around sort of March, April time, 2000, it became clear to people that something was wrong, and this internet boom looked as though it was actually really a bubble.
Now, in 2000, that was interesting. I was in San Francisco at the time, right?
Yeah.
In the heart of the whole dot-com revolution. Is that what you're referring to here, or
Yeah,
more than that?
No, it's the dot-com bubble.
Right.
And it literally burst as we had just stepped down.
So timing is everything.
So timing is absolutely everything. And the thing is that when this bubble burst, nobody really realized at the time that it had burst, because in America, a lot of people have to pay their taxes at the end of the tax year, and therefore you sort of expect to have some kind of downturn in the stock market as people basically sell assets in order to be able to pay money for their taxes. And so originally people thought that was going on, but then it became pretty clear that that wasn't the case. And so our whole funding strategy sort of started to unravel about how we're going to get sort of funding for it. And in the end, we got bought by an American company, and we basically ran their European business at the end of it. So timing in life is really, really important. And I have been on the winning side of timing, and I've also been on the losing side of timing throughout my career. And I think probably my greatest sort of recommendation for entrepreneurs is the understanding that you can have an absolutely fantastic idea, but you have no idea what's going to happen in the macro climate. And so speed of execution is really, really important, because the faster you are, the more likely you are to do what you need to do before some macro event hits you, which you have no control over.
So you get in and get out.
And completely derange. It's not get in and get out, it's just get going before bad stuff happens, which you have zero control over.
That gets in your way.
And just gets in your way. And I think there's lots of things in life you have some control over, some things you have no control over.
I talked about uncertainty, and people say, "Oh, there's never been a time where we've lived through more uncertain times." If you like, we go all the way back to Brexit and COVID and war and the cost of living crisis, but we've always had uncertainty. And
Totally.
entrepreneurial world is all about dealing with uncertainty and managing risk and actually taking advantage of uncertainty. Moving forward, then, and I might be skipping a few steps here, but you went to work with Shell. Now, most people think about Shell as petrochemicals, but you were in the renewable section. Was that purposeful, or did it happen by accident? And what happened there?
I got involved in doing research for a guy called Paul Hawken. And Paul wrote a book called Natural Capitalism, and also another book called Factor 4. And this was a sort of really sort of seminal book, and it's one of these sort of books which, totally changes your outlook on life. And Paul's general view was that to be good for the environment, you cannot be a charity-based activity set. So it's no good being a volunteer organization or a charity organization. And the reason why is because there's only a certain amount of money which is available for charitable activity.
For that purpose, right.
And what you really need to do is have a business which is self-sustaining and profitable. So you actually have to make money in order to be good. And so it was the concept of you need to make green money in order to be green. And this was sort of quite controversial for a lot of people, because a lot of people, the environment is almost has a sort of religious overtones to it. This is, and it becomes very, very much part of their identity.
Sacred almost.
Sort of sacred and stuff like that. And I always took the environment extraordinarily seriously, but Paul's book really made me focus and realize, okay, in order to do something actually worthwhile, you have to have a business which is profitable. Profit means they can reinvest in the business, you can do more of it. More profit means you can do more of it. More profit, you can do more of it, until eventually you're doing something which is really fundamentally worthwhile.
At scale as well.
At scale, because ultimately there's no point doing something which has very limited impact. So the big question is how you can have impact. And I actually approached Shell to see whether I could do some consulting work for them. What was interesting about that interview is it became very clear that the job was in Amsterdam, and I was living in London at the time, and I had I was just about to get married, and I thought there's no way my wife is going to sign off on me moving to Amsterdam, stuff like that. So the conversation switched from being an interview for a job to just a really interesting conversation between two people about the environment and about business and stuff like that. And he said, well, if you happen to change your mind, let me know, because this has been great. And I went home, and my wife said, well, actually, that sounds really fun. Let's go to Amsterdam. So I sort of called him up, and then I ended up working for Shell. And Shell was a really interesting company, and I was very excited about Shell. And I think that a lot of people who worked for Shell Renewables were also really excited, because essentially you have an organization which was extraordinarily wealthy, extraordinarily powerful, extraordinarily influential, and actually move into this fascinating world of clean energy. And so they had projects on solar, and they had wind, and they were looking at hydrogen, eventually looking at carbon dioxide, sequestration, stuff like that. And so I moved over. It was very, very exciting. And for a number of years, Shell looked like it was doing a great job. The number of wind projects we did, an increase. And I think, by the end, I think there's around at least $1 billion of wind farm projects which Shell had done.
And this was what period, what time?
And so this is the early 2000s. So this is 2002, 3, 4, 5.
That's a lot of money.
That kind of period of time. So Shell was doing really, really well. But the fundamental problem that an oil and gas company has is that they have a hurdle rate of how much money they need to make per project. And in the oil and gas sector, that was like a 16-70% internal rate of return. If you were in the regular power sector, like a electricity company producing electricity from coal or gas or something like that, you were probably in a 7-8% return. And so oil and gas, very, very high, electricity sector quite low, and renewables sort of came in around the 10% return. And so you had this sort of the weird scenario whereby an oil and gas major going from 16% to 10%, all renewable projects look terrible financially. Whereas from an electricity company going from 6 or 7% to 10%, all renewables project looked absolutely fantastic, a complete bonanza. And so same project, different perspective. And effectively what happened with Shell is that they were getting pressure from their investors saying, you're supposed to be a company doing oil and gas, you're supposed to be getting 16% return. What are you doing fiddling around with this renewable stuff? And so I think the investors put pressure on the board, put pressure on the CEO, but then put pressure on the organization to basically cut and run. And so it became very clear that Shell was no longer as committed to the renewable space, and Shell lost a lot of people who were doing it. They massively cut back on all their activities. And there was a hiatus of about a 10-year period of time where Shell did very, very little. And then about 10 years ago, they started to increase it again. Okay. But they wasted a huge amount of energy and effort. So Shell could have been one of the great players in the renewable space, but it kind of missed the opportunity.
And there was no incentive to hive that off or set up a separate company and, take it out from the organization that expected such a high rate of return into, maybe more aligned with the energy sector.
Because a conventional energy player looked at this as more attractive, what started to happen is that a lot of the energy companies moved into the renewable space. And so they started to do most of the projects rather than the oil and gas majors. But the great irony is that when you think about functionally what a company is, a big company is, they are really nothing more than a vehicle which creates dividends which pay out people's pensions. That's the sort of the fundamental basis of it. And what became clear about the wind energy sector, and very, very specifically about the solar sector, which is a very simple technology. Solar farms are basically glass panels on a fence with some wiring. They are very, very easy to build, very fast to build. You very rarely get cost overruns. You rarely get time overruns. They're very, very secure projects. And as a result of that, the return hurdle expectation for solar projects is very, very low. And so you can basically cut out a lot of the faff of projects failing that you would get in an oil and gas project or projects not working well in the energy sector and just focus on something very, very keen, which is just power. And so a lot of the pension funds started to invest directly into solar projects, and therefore they actually undercut the energy companies and they undercut the oil and gas players and stuff like that. But anyway, so I think the key part of this story is that I went from a large corporate Citibank, which I really enjoy. I ended up financially better off for my entrepreneurial period than I went in. So the sort of the financing side for that worked. And I always very much felt that my first foray into entrepreneurialism was effectively a paid-for MBA. So instead of going to university and getting an MBA and coming out with masses of debt, I kind of had to do all of the kind of things that you would think about that you get at an MBA, but I did it for real, and I ended up financially better off than I started. One thing which I've always tried to do in life is have essentially two targets. One target is that if everything goes great, this is what it could be. But if it doesn't go as well as expected, is second place or third place actually not a bad place to be?
Right.
And if you think about life like that, you sort of realize that risks are actually much more manageable than you really think they are. So when I left Citi, all my Citi colleagues and my boss said, no, I totally understand what you're doing. It's really, really exciting, but you're always welcome to come back. And then
a safety net.
There's a safety net. So I kind of knew that I could always go back to Citi. And then when I left Shell and I was asked to become CEO of a company which had just two small companies had merged together, and I was asked to take that company public, and I was one of the youngest people ever to list a company on the stock exchange. That was a really amazing experience. And yet again, my boss at Shell said, this is an amazing opportunity. Very, very few people will ever get this opportunity in their life. Just go ahead and do it. And if it doesn't work out, come back to us because we'd love to have you. And so there's a level of, there's a risk and you can get some great reward out of it, but there's a level of sort of safety net, comfort blanket.
So there's two really interesting observations there. One is building relationships over time and maintaining relationships. I'm not saying you always build a relationship so you can fall back on it, but it's a relationship which you can cultivate over time. And the second is risk. Most entrepreneurs think they have to bet the house and it has to come out in a particular way because of return, because of expectations, because of their personal expectations or shareholders' expectations. And a lot of that is true. But you're saying that, in terms of risk mitigation, that's what you're striving for. But if you don't hit that, it's not a failure because Plan B is quite good.
It doesn't have to be all or nothing, and I think your point about relationships is very apt. And I think one of the key things in life is that there are certain entrepreneurs who are very, very successful and are really not very nice people, and they become very, very successful, and you think, wow, that's incredible, they did it, and everybody really hates them. And then you have other people who are actually quite sort of decent people, decent, honourable people. And I think that you don't have to be a nasty person to be an entrepreneur. I think you actually can get on with people, you can respect people, you can like people, and then they like and respect and want to do nice things for you in return. Right. So I think relationships and basically caring about people, and also realizing that relationships are on a person-to-person basis. You don't have a relationship with a company. Companies are a mechanism for lots of individuals to work together on a collaborative effort, but they're all still individuals. And I think that one of the things I always love about sort of linguistics is just looking at where words come from. And company is a great example. Company is com with pan, bread, with bread. And so a compagnie, a companion, is somebody you break bread with. Wow. You share a meal with. And when you sort of think about company on that basis, it's like, do I want to have a nice meal with you? Do I want to spend time with you? Are you the kind of person I want to share bread with? Do I trust you? And so having that part in terms of relationship, I think is really, really important.
I think that's a good observation. I think there's an expectation that people who are very wealthy or very successful, or however way you want to define this, you have to clamber over dead bodies. You have to be a shit, and you have to be you just have to basically not like people. That's the only way you can be successful. And what you're saying is there are people like that.
Yeah.
But this is clearly the other side of the coin as well.
Yeah.
And you can decide which you want to be.
I think you can. I think you can do it. I think you do things where you maintain your own set of standards, your own set of honor, your own set of code of what is right and what is wrong, throughout that process. I think the idea is that you should always strive to be a good person. Sometimes you don't actually meet your own expectations, but I think you should always at least try to be.
So then, in terms of Shell, it seems to me like you're an entrepreneur really struggling to get out of the corporate world, and maybe tell me if that's an accurate observation or not, and you want to leave the shackles behind and do something on your own. Is that what led to the initiative in terms of Fischer Farms, or are we missing a piece in the middle?
I would have probably stayed at Shell for longer, but it basically became clear that they really were not pushing the renewable agenda, and I was asked to join the Shell sort of oil and gas business, and that was like a complete anathema to me. There's no way that I wanted to do that, and as a result of that, I sort of put my head above the parapet to sort of see what else was out there, and then I got headhunted to become the CEO of this company, which has been taken public. What I've managed to do throughout my career is sort of basically go from a large organization to a small organization, make it bigger, and then a large organization, and so I think I've seen the benefits of big. And I think there is a lot of benefits of what big can be, and I think there's a lot of benefits of what small can be as well. And I don't think there's one is perfect and the other is bad. I don't think it's as simple as that.
Let me take you through then to the next stage, which is really interesting in terms of the real entrepreneurial opportunity, which is setting up Fischer Farms yourself. It's a vertical farm business, obviously close to renewable energy in its ethos and its purpose driven, but also come back to what you said earlier. You need to be profitable. You need to have a business to actually do good on a large enough scale. Otherwise, you're not really doing good at all because you haven't got the wherewithal and you haven't got the sustainability with a small s to be sustainable with a big S. What was the initial decision point to say, okay, I'm going to do Fischer Farms, as it turned out?
One of the things that I did is we bought another company. That company's CEO became the CEO of the overall group. And then I spent a number of years as a board director, an investor, entrepreneur in a bunch of early stage clean energy companies. And then I set up my previous business, Lumicity. And Lumicity was developing solar projects in the UK. And also we developed biomass heating projects in packaged plant rooms. And we built 179 of those, and they went into 248 chicken turkey houses. And it was looking at the chicken turkey house which made me interested in food, and sort of looking at the sort of the crossover point between energy, climate change, and food. And as I was looking at this, and as I was spending more time researching about where does food come from, what are the issues associated with food, how is food grown in an environment where you've got global warming taking place, there's less good arable land, there's less water, there's more people, there's you've got population increase, you've got population momentum. And I was looking at all these things and thinking to myself, climate change is now effectively baked in. There is nothing we can do about climate change. We are working around the edges. We're putting in more renewables, more solar, more wind, more battery storage and stuff like that. But there are so many parts of the value chain that we're involved in which make increases in greenhouse gas emissions sort of inevitable. And we can try all we want to try to reduce those, and it's great that people are working on that. But I came to the conclusion that there is another problem which we have to do, which is effectively adaptation. How do you adapt? How do you adapt to a world which is experiencing climate change? And what would you do about it? Like, how do you feed the world without trashing the planet whilst climate change is taking place?
Right.
Because trashing the planet is what we're really good at. But my view is that as the number one sentient species on the planet, we have a responsibility, a duty of care to all of life, all of the flora and fauna on our planet. And we have the ability to destroy everything, but that is fundamentally wrong. In the same way that an adult has the ability to destroy a child, that is fundamentally wrong. We have the ability to destroy the planet, that is fundamentally wrong. So what do we do as a responsible adult about looking after the planet? And so I then thought, okay, well, there's issues with land. There's nothing which we can do about that. So the land issue is a lot of our farming practices are very, very destructive to the land. So the amount of topsoil erosion is a very clear example. Topsoil takes thousands of years to generate. So it does generate over thousands of years, but not in a useful time frame. We are also building new cities on some of our best farmland. So, if you go to places like China, you go to places like northern India, you've got towns which were 10,000, 20,000 people, which now may be 20 million people. And they're literally building on some of the prime agricultural real estate, which means that the farmland which they're using is moving towards the margins. And marginal farmland in a good year is great. If you have enough water, if you have enough fertilizer, and the environmental conditions are okay, you can get a decent crop. But that doesn't happen all the time. You will frequently get a year where everything isn't okay, and therefore your crop yields are way lower than they would have been in a piece of land which was actually very good at growing. So there's a sort of fundamental problem about the land, and if you don't have good land, you basically have lower agricultural yields. Then the second one is water. So 40% of all farms today on a global basis have significant water stress, as in they don't have enough water to do what they want to do. And also on a global basis, 25% of all farmland uses underground aquifer water as their primary source of irrigation for their fields. And the issue about this is that most hydrologists believe that in about 20 years' time, most of that underground aquifer water will be gone. So 25% of the world's food comes from a water source which in 20 years will no longer exist. That's actually a real problem. If you look at places like India now, you will have wells which are 1,000 meters deep, pumping water 1,000 meters from the surface up, because that is how low the water table has dropped. And it just goes down and down and down. And also, yet again, agricultural practices with use of things like fertilizers, increases soil salinity, and that salinity also gets into the water table, which means that the water that you're coming out with is increasingly damaging to the plants. So it's either gone or it's so poisonous that you can't actually use it, which is functionally not there. So you've got this problem with not as much land, not enough water. You've got population increase. So my father was born in 1930, 2 billion people when he was born. He is 95 this year. There are 8.1 billion people. So he's gone from 2 billion to 8.1 billion in one person's lifetime. Mm-hmm. And the middle class population in the year 2000 was about 1 billion people, predominantly in Europe and North America, is now about 4.5 billion.
Just think about that. In 2000, 1 billion middle class.
Yeah, and now it's about 4.5.
Wow.
And so from a humanitarian perspective, getting 1 billion people to 4.5 billion people in a 25-year period of time is a phenomenal success for humanity. Like, wow, we have done phenomenally well. And, the reality is that most of that credit needs to go to China because they have really done an incredible job at bringing people out of poverty, and that has then spread those sort of similar kind of practices.
But these middle classes are consumption hungry, right?
Exactly. So the middle class is fantastic from a humanitarian sort of level of social improvement. Absolutely fantastic. But 4.5 million people, middle class, have a significantly greater impact on the environment because they want to eat fish and salmon, they want to have salads, and they want to go traveling, and they want to have gadgets, and they're all the things which we take for granted in the West. Everybody else wants to take for granted and around the rest of the world as well, and it's completely natural. And why shouldn't they want what we have in the West? But that means that the demand on the planet is now significantly greater than it has ever been. So when you put all these things together, when I was thinking about what I wanted to do with my life, it's like, well, here is an identifiable problem. We are running out of good land. We're running out of water. At the same time, climate change is just making everything worse. And the way I think about climate change is, you've got a sort of a fire going, and climate change is sort of getting sort of squirty bottle of lighter fluid and just sort of squirting it on the fly, and just makes things worse. So climate change is a separate problem to the fundamental problem, which is water and land and population momentum, growth, and middle class population. So it's a separate problem, but it just makes the underlying problem much, much, much worse than it would have been. And many people think that actually, ultimately, climate change will make even the underlying problem much, much worse than it would have been otherwise as well. So the question, what do you do about it? And so I spent some time looking at onshore fisheries. So the amount of fish which have been taken out of the oceans is just catastrophic. What's fascinating about the fish story is that people rebase how bad the problem is every few years. So they'll say, well, it's 70% reduction in these fish stocks since the 1980s. But the 1980s is probably a 90% reduction in fish stocks from 1900. So you could rebase it again and say, well, it's a 50% reduction since the year 2000. It's like the numbers of fish in the ocean are being taken out at a really quite a catastrophic rate. And what's even worse is that you have now fisheries which are going to the very base of the marine ecosystem, which is krill. So you have literally just billions of tons of krill being harvested now and being used for either things like fish food or other things like that.
Which is what whales rely on.
Everything relies on it. It's something a little fish eats a big fish eats a little fish, and there's another fish which eats that one, another fish eats that one, and they all basically eat something. And then if you get rid of the very basis of everything, then the entire eco chain sort of collapses on top of that. So fisheries was very interesting. Then I spent quite a lot of time looking at that. So onshore salmon production, onshore prawn production. But then I came up with a view that actually vertical farming is probably the most useful and interesting thing to be doing as an entrepreneur.
Right, let me hold you there. I'll hold you at that point because I think that's a fascinating story, because a lot of time we talk about, and I advise wannabe entrepreneurs to like, the question is why? What's your ambition? Why do you want to do this? So what problem are you solving? Typically it's a problem for a target audience or a customer or a consumer if a consumer product's idea. We've got lots of different reasons there where you're solving problems, not just for one customer, but for many, many customers. In fact, for humanity, for the climate. Now, once you say that, that's incredibly motivational. When you get to next talk about what you're going to do about it. But that's a big problem you're trying to solve. How do you get your arms around that big problem and these big challenges to actually, how do you eat an elephant? How do you, step by step, try to make a difference?
You only have one life. And the question is, what are you going to do with that life which is worthwhile? And what people's interpretation of what is worthwhile is completely different. And some people are, I want to be the world's greatest musician, or I want to be the world's greatest football player, whatever. So what is worthwhile is totally linked to you as an individual. What people should strive for in life is to have a goal which they believe is a worthwhile goal. And it doesn't have to be anything heroic. No, it doesn't have to be like, I want to save the world and feed everybody. It doesn't have to be that. It doesn't have to be, I want to be the world's greatest sportsman. It can be, I want to be a great member of my community. I want to be a great dad. I want to be a great mother. I want to be whatever it is, but it's just to the sense that what you're doing is the best of your ability. And you get pride in whatever it is that you're actually doing. And so I think that is a very, very important driver. And I think that if you have that in your mind, that you're doing, you're doing a really good job of it. Like you're a great daughter. You're a great sister. Those are the kind of things you're like. That's a good thing to do in life. You're being a very caring person. Those are things which are worthwhile doing. So everybody has their own calling about what is worthwhile. And I talk a lot about agency. And agency is an individual's ability to control their own lives and not to be dependent on what other people think or do and stuff like that, to effectively sort of control them. So if you are in control of your own life, if you have agency, it gives you a huge amount of power, it gives you a huge amount of purpose that you can control. My view is that what people do with that agency, as I said, is completely different for everybody. I have interpreted my way of feeling useful by doing things which are on a larger scale. So how do you feed the world without trashing the planet is not a little ambition. No, this is a pretty significant ambition. But it goes back to some of my early thoughts in life, is that somebody's got to do it, so it might as well be you.
I'm sure that will be inspiration to a lot of people listening to this. And one of the great reasons, one of the fundamental reasons why it's so inspirational is it's so simple. It doesn't get complicated. It's not overthinking. A lot of different layers, and you kind of get lost in it. It really cuts to the chase of what you just said. And I'm not going to try to repeat it because you've said it very eloquently. I think the simplicity in what you're saying, large scale, small scale, but being the best person you could be, or the best, reaching your potential in some way, that's got to be worthwhile. Turning the other way around, it's very difficult to argue against that.
Yeah.
Right? Absolutely.
Yeah.
So then, Fischer Farms, that's not going to solve all the world's problems, but it can certainly play a major part in a very discreet way in terms of some of the things you've explained. So how does that work then? You set this business up to achieve those goals?
I have seen in my own career, and know when I look at the sort of renewable energy space, a series of technologies which, when they started, were really not very good and were very, very expensive. So if I look at the solar sector, if I look at the wind sector, if I look at the battery storage sector, these are sectors where you have seen over a 25-year period of time a incredible collapse in the cost of those technologies. And as a result of the collapse in the cost of doing those technologies, you have seen a massive increase in terms of those technologies out in the wild and actually doing things and so forth. So to give you some ideas, so in about year 2000, in the European Union, the amount of kilowatt hours of electricity generated by solar and by wind was close to zero, like really useless.
In the year 2000?
In the year 2000.
That's your base point.
So by 2023, the European Union, if you add solar and wind together, was over 25% of the electricity generated, not installed, which could be installed and not doing anything, but actually kilowatt hours generated was 25%, which was larger than coal, larger than nuclear, larger than natural gas on an individual basis. And so you've gone from a technology which is pretty much zero to 25% in a 22, 23-year period of time. And that is because the price of these products has just collapsed, and the numbers continue to go down. So battery storage technology would have been around $10,000 a kilowatt hour. In China, prices last year for batteries was about $65, so $10,000 a kilowatt hour to $65 a kilowatt hour. So you can see these sort of massive drops in there. Same things have happened for the solar side, same things happen on the wind side. When I look at vertical farming, I'm very conscious of the fact that the price point, what you have today, is a lot more expensive than a field and a lot more expensive than you have for a glass house. But you can see how this technology can drop and drop and drop and drop and drop and drop in price over time to get to a point where you're starting off now and you think, well, you're expensive, but you can say, okay, I'm just going to push time forward for 25 years, and I'm just going to follow what happened to the solar and wind and batteries and say, what can I do about this technology which makes it as analogous as possible with those three technologies, as opposed to other technologies which have always remained expensive? Why is it that one technology you can see this massive drop and the other you can't? And fundamentally, technology gets cheaper by economies of scale and learning by doing. And this is, think about televisions. So televisions now, you get insanely large TVs at incredibly low prices and with really high quality. And yet again, this is a technology which has just gotten cheaper and cheaper and cheaper and qualitatively better and better and better over time. And I think that what a lot of these technologies have in common is that they can be built in a factory, and then they can connect into a supply chain, which is a global supply chain, and allows you to build lots of them. And as the price goes down, the addressable market increases, which means that you're doing more, and therefore the price goes down, which opens up another market, which means that your economies of scale get better and better, which means that you can then price goes down, which then opens up another market. And then so as you go from one price level to the next, your addressable market gets much bigger, which then makes your pricing cheaper, which means another addressable market.
In terms of building a vertical farm, it's very expensive. You got to put a lot of capital. It's very capital intensive. You got to build a factory or build a plant way before you have revenue.
Yeah.
And number two, you have to have a long-term strategy, which sounds much more like a Chinese approach than a European approach or certainly a US approach. So those two things don't always exist unless you have a source of patient capital that can support your vision.
You raise a very interesting point, which is the difference between certain regions of the world in terms of how they're looking at things. And, China is a great example of a country which has very, very long-term thinking about what it wants to do with its economy. And a lot of it is still on the catch-up phase. So they understand what needs to be done because the West has already done it. And so it's much easier to be a fast follower when somebody else has already sort of hacked their path through the rainforests and sort of got to the other side. It's much easier to follow. Once you've caught up, then it becomes much harder to actually have a planned economy because you really have no idea what happens beyond the frontier of where we are today. So I think China can follow very, very quickly, but China is also an extraordinarily entrepreneurial environment, which has been extremely well backed by government forces and so forth like that, in terms of whether it's low cost loans or easy planning permission to get things done, or easy permitting. So you just get things done in China and build things at a significantly faster pace than you can in the West. Now, the West has an inability to have these long-term plans, predominantly linked to how our democratic process works. So a democratic process, our election cycles are quite short. The period of time that the government is in government is actually relatively short compared to a a Chinese system, which
Exactly.
is basically in perpetuity. So it's very difficult for governments to have sort of really, really long-term plans and visions, and sometimes just get governments coming in, and the next government just changes all the rules of what the previous government wanted in place, and so you sort of go sort of stop-start and things like that. I think one of the areas where the West has been consistent over the last 10, 20 years, depending how you want to count it, I think is on the environment. And I think the environment in the West and wanting to do something about the environment has morphed into a quasi-religious belief system. And the great thing about a religious system is that it can really be self-sustaining. You can believe in something for quite some time, and if you've got a sort of generation or two now of people who fundamentally believe that climate change is happening, we need to do something about climate change. If we don't do something about climate change, we're all going to die, and we're going to have no successor generations. Then that ideology permeates throughout government, permeates throughout the investor community, permeates throughout companies. And there's a lot of pressure that you get from the younger generation on the older generation to do something about it. So a good example, I was at a conference a number of years ago, which was for investors, predominantly in sort of pension funds, about the environment. And, they was talking about how, there's pressure from pension funds to invest in environmentally friendly activities. And one of the panelists was asked, where are you seeing a lot of this pressure coming from? And he said, my children. And he said, I go home and my child is asking me, Daddy, what are you doing about climate change? And to have no answer to that in front of your child is actually really quite a terrifying thing as a parent to have. Like, we have a problem here. We all understand there's a problem here, but what are you doing about it? And if the answer is, I'm making the problem worse or nothing, that's not a very inspiring thing for you to have. And after this gentleman said this, the other panelists all sort of raised their hands and say, yeah, we're getting exactly the same pressure
That's
from
why I'm
our
here.
children. Exactly the same pressure from their children. So their children are actually pushing them to do this. And so this is a really interesting thing because, there's a sense that, companies and governments and adults are in control. But in many cases, you could argue that actually it's the children who are in control of the agenda, and they are pushing their parents to do this. And so I think that businesses which are linked to the environment, like what Fischer Farms is doing, I think in many cases have a more sustainable legal framework, government framework, investor framework, employee framework than a lot of other companies who may be in other sectors. So I think that there is an advantage. I think we almost have a long-termism about climate change related businesses because the problem we're trying to solve is a long-term problem by its own very nature. Entrepreneurs and investors in other types of businesses which are much more short-term won't necessarily have that long-termism with their investment activity set. So if you've got a business which is developing a new widget or a new toy or a new whatever, the investor community is probably going to be much more pushy in terms of when they expect you to get the kind of return for it. So I think what you do as an entrepreneur matters. And I think if you are involved in the environmental side, I think that is a helpful place to get long-term patient capital. And I think one of the advantages of doing things like what we're doing at Fischer Farms is that the problem we're trying to solve is so enormous that the addressable market is essentially infinite. And this is yet again another big issue that investor has. Like, how big is your market? Well, my market is the entire farming community, effectively, like everything that grows. And at Fischer Farms, we basically split the world into 3 phases in terms of what we think is going to happen. And each phase starts off with a small market, and the more we do, we get to another market which is bigger, and then another market which is bigger. So our first phase is what we refer to as short leafy green things. So these are salads and herbs. Now, feeding people with salads and herbs is not feeding the planet. They are fundamentally herbs and salads. And if you gave somebody a diet of herbs and salads, they would die. They are not going to get the calories. They're not going to get the protein in order to be able to survive off salads and herbs. So on the one side, it's actually a relatively pointless activity. However, there is a demand for salads and herbs. Those plants grow in fields or in glass houses and things like that. So there's a cost. They take up a lot of space. They take up a lot of land. They use a lot of water. So our vertical farm grows in 1 acre the equivalent of 250 acres of British farmland.
Wow.
So from a land use perspective, we are absolutely astoundingly good. From a water perspective, we use about 5% of the water of a conventional farm. Yet again, incredibly good. So I talked about earlier about problems with land, talked about problems with water. Here you have a solution which uses a fraction of the land and a fraction of the water. We use about 8% of the fertilizers of a conventional farm. So yet again, massively beneficial on that. Access to fertilizers, and especially things like potash, is actually a real crisis. Most people aren't aware that most of our phosphorus comes from Northwest Africa, and that's kind of it. There's some other little deposits, but there's a huge concentration, and that is completely necessary for all life. All of the issues which you have from an environmental perspective downstream of that, we don't have. And we don't have it because our water just goes round and around in a closed loop system and is constantly recycled. And so we're not releasing these issues into the water stream. So even though from a calorific perspective, short leafy greens don't do much, from an environmental perspective, they actually are very beneficial in terms of not creating these other problems for other people.
And presumably it allows you to test the technology to get to your next phase.
And exactly. And so basically what it means is we have an addressable market now where we can make money, we are profitable, to then allow us to develop and scale, improve the technology, which allows us to go to our next phase. Our next phase is what we refer to as fruity things. I'm not a marketer. Strawberries and blueberries and raspberries, mushrooms, which technically aren't fruit or are fruit, depending which way you categorize them for the part which is growing under it. Those are products which actually have some useful calories and actually have a whole bunch of useful nutrients. So they are more food in terms of human consumption. Still not the sort of the fundamentals. You can't really live off fruit. You could do a half decent job, but it's not that advisable. Our phase 3 crops are proteins and carbohydrates. And so this is rice and wheat, which represent 52% of human calorie intake come from rice and wheat. And soy and peas, which are fantastic protein substitutes for meat. So if you can grow those 4 products, plus the phase 2 fruity things and the salads, you basically can actually feed the world. The whole world can be fed using this type of vertical farming system.
What happens when something comes in from left field, like energy, like the war, like Russia, the effect of, and it happened and it's kind of eased a little bit now, but that was something that couldn't have been predicted really. Maybe it could have been, but it was an assumption you made about the cost of energy. It's a very energy hungry operation. Vertical farming is, right. So how do you deal with that, or how did you deal with that? What happened there?
So energy, as you point out, is probably the single largest cost and most important factor in a vertical farm, and it's because we use a lot of lights. So our lights may be very efficient, but if you have lots of something which is very efficient, you still have a lot of whatever it is. We basically made a whole series of assumptions in terms of what our electricity prices were going to be for our second farm, and we did it based off some actual knowledge and reality of what we knew. So we were spending about 6.5 pence a kilowatt hour for all of our solar energy for our first farm. So all our daylight power comes from a solar farm, and at 6.5 pence. And at the time, the price of importing electricity from the grid was roughly in the sort of 11, 12 pence per kilowatt hour. So on a weighted average basis, we thought that farm 2 should be in the 9, maybe 10 pence a kilowatt hour. We're now paying 22 pence a kilowatt hour. So more than double of what all of our business planning
Assumptions.
was on the biggest cost part of our operations. And that has been incredibly disruptive. And so we had to scramble to come up with a series of alternative products which weren't in our original business plan, which actually mean that some of our equipment that we designed the farm to build aren't being used because we're not growing a product which actually can make use of that technology.
And these are products you could sell at a higher price to compensate for the extra cost?
Yeah, exactly. So these are the products which you can sell at a higher price to compensate for the extra electricity cost. Nobody anticipated really that the UK was going to end up with some of the highest electricity prices in the world on a industrial commercial basis. That is significantly higher than most countries in the G7, in the G20. It's just a very, very expensive place to do, and a lot of it is to do with climate change initiatives, which are basically burdening companies with very, very high cost electricity. Now, one of the advantages of being in a bad place is that you have to respond to it. And so one of the things that we are really, really very much focused on is like, how do we keep our electricity prices? Well, we can't do much about electricity, but how do we keep our electricity consumption down? So there's a lot of initiatives about how do we deal with that. And this is yet again a kind of an interesting thing where if you have something which is very, very low cost, actually people just use a lot of it. If you have something which is very expensive, people just use less of it. And so, I think the UK is this sort of weird scenario where actually more and more businesses are really looking for things to become more energy efficient. And that actually becomes a competitive advantage when you go into other markets, because essentially you are having a product which is more energy efficient than it would have been, because it had to be in your own local market. So you go to another market, you actually are really low cost compared to everything else as well.
Right.
So I think that sometimes you need to see adversity as actually a benefit. No, you just got to take advantage of these kinds of.
Now that's really easy to say, and I say it myself. I embrace adversity because it's usually an opportunity. It makes you more competitive, absolutely. But it's very difficult in the moment. Yeah, we talked a lot about resilience and realizing there's a problem, and okay, you have a set of assumptions to try to predict the future, but then something happens like you just described. Unpredictable. What do you do about it then? The tendency is a huge assumption, overexposed to energy costs. Oh, it's not going to work. Give up, right? Or it's going to be so much different than what I thought it was going to be. What you're saying is step back a moment, take the opportunity that adversity presents itself with here, or presents you with, and do something about it. Okay, try to push the price up if you can, try to reduce consumption of the and try to find a different way around getting to the ultimate objective that you got, which is right now. But in the meantime, you've got shareholders going, I thought this was going to work, and you've got commitments made to customers, you've got large capital, there's a lot of pressure. So it's easy to say that. So what does it really feel like at the time?
It is easy to say a lot of these things. And, the reality is that there are a lot of vertical farm businesses which have now died. The way I sort of generally respond to this is that we've got to go back to the 1890s. And imagine you're in the car industry in the 1890s and you're just starting to develop, and there's lots of different ways of doing cars. You've got cars which have sticks to move instead of a steering wheel. You've got coal-powered cars, you've got battery cars, you've got hydrogen cars, you've got various different types of liquid fuel-based cars. You've got the driver's seat at the back, you've got at the front. There's a whole range of different models. And then, Benz comes along, Mercedes comes along, and they start to develop a sort of car, a sort of type, which becomes sort of an archetype of what cars are going to look at. But it's only really until Henry comes along with his Model T Ford, where his mantra was, I want to produce a car which is so cheap that my employees can buy the car. So shifting from a super luxury item, which is hand built, bespoke, which all the Mercedes and the Benz guys were doing, into something which is very, very mass produced.
Mass market.
And so when I think about Fischer Farms, I'm thinking about that analog. I'm very, very explicitly thinking about it, that there were masses of car companies which died in that early phase. And some of them died because their main shareholder lost interest, or the main designer died, they grew too quickly and they ran out of cash and they imploded. And there are lots of, and it's worth noting that most businesses, small businesses, die within the first 3 years or so. The track record of entrepreneurialism is actually really terrible. It's really hard to be an entrepreneur, and most don't make it. And if you look at the vertical farm industry, there are not that many vertical farms. And so when vertical farm companies die, there's like, well, is it an issue about the overall market? Or is it actually just simply an issue that some companies made slightly the wrong choices, or they had investors who weren't able to have the kind of commitment long-term associated with it, or they went into a cul-de-sac from a technology perspective? And yet I get sort of comfort that I think, okay, if I can become Henry with the Model T, what do I need to do about it? And so yet again, when we are developing our new generation of modular vertical farms in our factory in Birmingham, I'm looking at it as, okay, how do I get onto the Henry Ford Model T run of really, really low cost systems? And we think that by being smarter and getting better procurement, better volumes, we should actually reduce that price to half of it again. And so then you're starting to get 5 times cheaper than my last big building farm. And then there are other parts of the world where electricity prices aren't as crazy expensive as they are here. And so, here we're spending about 22p a kilowatt hour, but, some of the locations we're looking at, the prices between 1p and 3p a kilowatt hour. And that suddenly becomes transformational in terms of your business. That 1 to 3 pence per kilowatt hour is, I think, where the electricity prices on a long-term basis is going to be going to. And there is an inevitability about that. And why is there an inevitability? The inevitability is because of solar and battery combinations. So solar is already unbelievably cheap. Batteries, as I said, $10,000 a kilowatt hour to $65 a kilowatt hour. Those numbers have continued to go down through economies of scale, learning by doing. The markets get bigger. And battery technology is one of these fascinating technologies because it's a technology which now spans 2 major energy markets. It spans the electricity supply market in terms of storing electricity to then being released for the lights in the studio, whatever it might be. And it is also in the vehicle mobility market, so batteries in electric vehicles. And what you get through that system is a accelerated learning cycle that you get from mobile vehicles, because cars last about 7 years. You are constantly updating and upgrading the batteries, getting batteries which are lighter, longer range, use less exotic materials, constantly dropping on the price. And those batteries, the same cells that are in those batteries, are used for battery storage, but battery storage is on a massive scale. So you've got a new technology being deployed at huge scale for the electricity market, which means that they have volume capacity, which means that they get the learning by doing and they get the scaling, which means that the battery becomes even cheaper again. And that's one of the reasons why electric cars are becoming so cheap, because you've just got this connection between the two of them. And what's fascinating about vertical farming is that vertical farming is now actually becoming part of that space, because our core function, our core cost is electricity. And so now farming is becoming part of mobility market, right, and becoming part of the electricity market, and now it is in the farming market, which means that they all reinforce each other. So the more batteries for cars for stationary storage, that means that our farming is cheaper, and therefore there is a bigger addressable market for farming, which means that cheaper batteries for the cars, for the stationary storage, and then it gets cheaper for vertical farming. And so you can see over time that having electricity at the 2 pence, 3 pence, 1 pence per kilowatt hour is almost inevitable about where we're going to be going for these technologies, which means that the promised land that I have of phase 3 crops where we can grow the rice and the wheat and the soy and the peas is actually achievable based on the knowledge of the current technological trends of the things which is going on. So it is going to happen. And so from going back to an investor perspective, you have really a choice. You can stick with a program and just know that there's an inevitability that you're going to end up with a product which is just incredibly low cost. Or you can abandon ship and go, oh, it's too difficult now because it didn't quite work out the way it is now. And then,
But it never does.
But the guarantee is that you have gone out too early.
It reminds me of Kipling. If you can keep your head while everybody around you is losing theirs, then that's a wonderful place to be. Again, so much easier said than done. Talk to me a little bit, because I'm very much aware of it, having worked closely with you. Your view on culture, and you talked a lot about kindness before. I remember very well, and it's easy to say, but what does it really mean? And what does it mean to people who work at Fischer Farms? What should it mean? What does it mean? And how does it transcend all the problems and challenges we feel on a daily basis into, I'm going to treat people with respect and with kindness. Culture at Fischer Farms.
So culture is sort of critical for any organization, and it's very hard. And it's also very hard as a leader in an organization, because you're basically one person and you're trying to make sure that other people share that type of culture. And so at Fischer Farms, we have a 4+1 cultural sort of structure. So we have what I refer to as sort of the soft side, and then we have the slightly hard side. So the soft side are, we want people to be kind to each other. And kindness is simple things of opening the door, saying hello, being polite when a new person comes in, greeting them and saying, how are you, and things like that. Kindness also means just not being mean. Just don't be an unpleasant person on an unnecessary basis. So kindness is important, because you have to work on the assumption that people are humans, and humans are going through a life cycle. And in that life cycle, they will go through happy and sad points. They will have periods of time where it's all great, they've got young kids and and then one of the kids gets sick, or their parents get sick, or their wife leaves them, or whatever it might be, or they'll get some kind of illness or disease. And so my general view is that you don't know what is going on in somebody's personal life. And sometimes what people's personal lives are really terrible, like terrible situation. They're coming into work and they've got a happy smiley face on and they're doing the work, but they're dying inside. And so if you have an environment where people are actually kind to each other at work can actually become a refuge from the various issues which they may be having in their own personal life. And so if you are kind to people, that is really, really helpful. And so we really want to encourage kindness. The other thing which we want to encourage is respect. And respect isn't, I want people to respect me. It's rather, you need to respect others. Because you can never control whether people respect you or not, but you can control whether you respect other people. So it's all about agency. Again, you have control. What do you have control of? Don't expect other people to be kind to you or nice to you, but you can be nice to somebody else, and you can be respectful to somebody else. And respectful are little things like doing things when you say you're going to do something, asking for things which are realistic and reasonable. So like, I have to have this done by this o'clock on a Friday. It's like, well, are you actually going to do anything with it? Or could you actually wait until the Monday? And it's like, if you're not actually going to do anything with it, well, maybe actually have a deadline which is slightly longer than you actually need. Saying on a Friday afternoon, I want you to do this, and then people have to work the weekend, but you're actually not going to do anything on Monday and Tuesday. So why not just give them until Monday and Tuesday instead of going through them? So respect, I think, is an important part, and kindness. If you had an organization that was just respectful and kindness, I think you'd be basically sort of dancing around the campfire singing Kumbaya, my lord, and you wouldn't necessarily get anywhere as an organization. Very important, but not necessarily the only thing. So those are my soft parts. The hard parts that I think you need to have an organization, one is factfulness. So factfulness is when you actually tell the truth the whole time about what the situation is. And it's very easy in an organization to wish something were to be true and therefore state that is the truth. So, for example, you think that in a few weeks' time, you will have achieved this particular target. And so you'll say, I have achieved this target. Well, you actually haven't achieved this target. If a whole series of assumptions take place, yeah, you might achieve that target. But today, that actually isn't the case. You need to be very, very specific. And then on the other part of the of factfulness is on the other side is robustness. So robustness is you actually have to be able to take some hits and not complain about it. So people can't always be kind. They can't always be respectful. Sometimes people are just busy, and so they may say things in a slightly curt way, and they're not intending to be mean. But if you don't have a level of robustness about you, people have to walk around on eggshells the entire time, which is also really painful in organizations. So you need to be able to be robust enough to be able to, when somebody says this is wrong, and this is the reason why it's wrong, and these are the facts as why it's wrong. You can't go, oh no, you're so mean to me. It's like, well, no, these are the facts. Mm-hmm. And you as an individual have to have that robustness to actually say, okay, you're right, I was wrong, and own it, and own the problem. And so one of the things I also talk about is if something goes wrong, tell people early. Give bad news as early as you possibly can, because what frequently happens in any kind of organization is that people go, something bad has happened, but I'm going to fix it. And then a day goes by, and then a week goes by, and they haven't actually fixed it until eventually they realize they can't fix it. And then they tell the rest of the organization, this happened, and I can't fix it. But it's now too late. The problem is actually really much. So there needs to be a level of robustness. So those things together, I think, are really important. And then they furnish a fifth point, which is about innovation. And so my general view on innovation is that is the most critical thing in any kind of organization, is how people innovate. And innovation is not one person having a great idea. It's actually several people having terrible ideas. So if I have a half-baked crazy idea, which really is not a very good idea, and you have a really sort of insane idea, which really is not a very good idea, and John and Jack have other kind of ideas which also fundamentally aren't very good ideas. If you're in an environment where people feel comfortable about putting ideas on the table because people are kind, because people are respectful, because people are generally factful, because you are robust enough to be able to have a good conversation, what can happen is that those terrible ideas together can morph into a genius, brilliant idea that none of us individually could have ever thought about had we not put those ideas on the table. And so you need to have a culture where people are comfortable about putting, quite frankly, bad ideas on the table. Not a good idea pretending to be a bad idea, but literally bad ideas. And then the question is, do you have those ideals translate into reality? And I think the answer is no. And the reason why it's no is because these are ideals which you can always do more of. You can always be kinder. You can always be more factful. You can always be more robust. You can always do you can always do more of them. It's not something which you ever reach as a destination. It's much more of like a signal. It's like a direction to focus on, rather than you have achieved this, or you rank yourself a 5 out of 5 or a 4 out of 4 or a 4 out of 5 in one particular area. It's like, this is the direction we want to get in. And I think we need to remind ourselves as companions eating bread together, people who are in this journey, that this is something which is worth doing because it actually creates a better environment to work in and a more innovative environment, and therefore more likely to be able to succeed. Going back to the earlier point that if you succeed as a business, you become profitable. Profitable means you do more of it and you do more worthwhile things at the end.
I remember at Little Dish, we strive to have a supportive environment where we're demanding of each other. Kind of similar in a way to what you were saying. And people say, supportive and demanding in the same sentence makes no sense. But it does. No. We are demanding because we're a business. We have to get results. Why would I take this personally? If you need something done, we'll do our best to do it and be respectful. AI and automation, two different things, obviously, but I know they're both close to your heart and you have a particular view on this in terms of the future, but also the present. Talk to us about that. What AI and automation, or separated out in terms of the different examples, means for business in the UK today.
I use AI every day. And so I'm a sort of big consumer of it. And I mainly use it to ask questions and to do what I refer to sort of preliminary research on particular thoughts and particular ideas. So I'm a sort of an active user of it. I've also used things like Cursor to do some programming. I have effectively zero programming actual capabilities, but it allows me to see what is actually possible and what is capable out there. And it's a technology which I can see more and more use cases, and I think it's a technology which I think is going to allow people to become increasingly productive. So I think that the idea that AI is going to sort of take all jobs away and stuff like that, I'm not particularly convinced by. I think that it's going to make a lot of people significantly more productive than they would have been on an individual basis, and that's not a bad thing at all. The other thing is on the sort of robotic side. Now, people have been automating things for a very, very long time. So automation is not unusual. I think what is unusual about the new forms of robots which are coming out there, the sort of the humanoid robots, is essentially these humanoid robots are human drop-in replacements, and they are not dumb replacements, but these are robots which are effectively AI in a humanoid form. Those types of skill sets I think are very interesting, and I think they're particularly interesting in a world where total fertility rates on a global basis, with the single exception of Africa, are going in the negative down.
Right.
And so, we're in an interesting situation now where we've got population momentum means that our population is increasing, and it's going to probably go to about 10 billion. So you've got this sort of numbers of people going up, but yet again, simultaneous to that, in most countries, the total fertility rate is less than 2.1. And 2.1 is the magic number, where if every woman has 2.1 children, that is a replacement level. The 0.1 is the factor in people just dying before they can have kids. So the actual number is 2, but 2.1 is the number.
2.1 keeps you where you are.
Keeps someone's population stable. If you look at somewhere like China today, so the latest stats which came out a week or so ago have the Chinese total fertility rate at 1.02. And 1.02 means that every generation is halving. And so you've got this sort of weird scenario where the population at the moment is still going up, but also each generation is halving. So how does that work? And it works because I exist, one person, my child exists, that's two people, so it's doubled, and then I'm alive long enough for my grandchild to live, so that's three people. So you've got a factor of 3 increase from 1 to 2 to 3.
Living all at the same time.
All living at the same time, but actually each generation is halving in that process. And so what you're going to start to see is this increase in population and then a really quite dramatic drop in population. And so Japan is one of the leaders in total fertility rate collapse. You're already seeing the population start to decline. China is about 1.4 billion people now. China's in about 50 years' time is going to be about 700 million.
50 years, it halves. Wow.
So you got this sort of increase and then decrease. And so one of the big issues you have in any kind of developed society is that our social security program is basically a gigantic Ponzi scheme, whereby we need lots of working people to pay for the older generation. And what has started to happen over time is that instead of having a population pyramid, we've basically gone from a population pyramid to essentially a population column with a sort of a little peak at the end because everybody's finally dying off at a later stage. And so you've got a very large number of people who are essentially dependent on a relatively small number of workers to pay for all of the retirees, but also to pay for the education, schooling, and things like that for all of the younger generation at all below them. And so you're getting a smaller and smaller and smaller tax base over time. And this is really problematic because a lot of people in that bracket are going to say, what on earth is the point of doing anything? Because all I'm doing is paying for everybody else. And also, it's worth noting that retirement age is not keeping up with population average lifespan. So when Bismarck created the first pension scheme in Prussia before it became the German Empire, the age of pensionable age was 10 years higher than the life expectancy. And so the idea is that for the first 10 years of retirement, you should be paying it. And then thereafter, if you've somehow managed to live 10 years longer than the average, we as the government are going to bail you out. Whereas now we're in a situation where in some countries like China, the retirement age is in the mid-50s. You could be living to your 90 or 100. You could be having potentially 30, 40 years of being a retiree rather than the original design of Bismarck, where you hopefully will never get to that point as well. So you've got lots of people focus on a smaller number of people who are actually making the money. And so robots and artificial intelligence basically increase the productivity of creating essentially sort of a ghost population,
That base again.
which of people who are actually able to do things. And so, it could be that each person has 2 or 3 robot equivalents with an AI equivalent who are doing more and more work. And so essentially you've got as a ghost population or shadow population, which basically creates a virtually larger pool of workers doing things for supporting the older generation and the younger generation at the same time. If we look at Fischer Farms, a lot of the systems which we have put in place now in terms of how things are going to be working have been designed with the fact that we think humanoid robots are coming. And the question is, how long is it going to take? And so what I mean by this is that factory designs historically have been, were originally going back to the early car industry, very, very dominated by humans doing very, very specific skills with one individual who could do 5 or 6 or 7 skills. And then gradually you move to an automation line where you be doing exactly the same thing again and again and again and again. And then more and more those again and again jobs are being replaced by automation, robotics, the sort of your conventional form of robotics, that you get get out there. So those are all the things which you're used to seeing. But I think what you're going to start to see now in factories is humanoid robots are going to be taking the place of some of these very large automation systems at a significantly lower cost than these big automation systems. So we're going to have effectively a worker who can work nearly 24 hours a day at an incredibly low price point. And these workers are very, very capable of doing multiple roles rather than an automation system which is only able to do one thing very, very, very well. So I think the cost of setting up factories, the cost of automating things, I think is going to really, really drop. And so I think you're going to see a lot more sort of bespoke type of mini factories doing things, combination of humanoid robots plus things like 3D printing and things like that. So I think you're going to see a kind of a revolution in manufacturing over the next 10, 20 years as people learn how to take advantage of these particular new ways of doing things. And I think that's going to be very, very exciting.
It's a very constructive way of looking at things. You're clearly an optimist because a lot of people talk about dread AI, dread the onset of robotics, and I think are very fearful of what it's going to do and take my job away. Whereas you're saying, it's actually going to solve some structural problems into the future. I'd love to hear your view on, finally, work-life balance. And what that means to the newer generation, what it means to maybe the older generation as well, how you see that working out in terms of burnout, in terms of tenacity, in terms of resilience. That's a big topic on its own right. But what does it mean to you, maybe observationally, what does it mean to you? And what have you seen about that particular topic in Fischer Farms or other businesses like Close Quarters?
I think one of the key things to remember is that life is a marathon and not a sprint. And if you do anything too intensively for a prolonged period of time, you will burn out. And burnout isn't just you as an individual, but burnout is you as a member of your family group. And I think there are a lot of entrepreneurs who end up and a lot of high-powered people who end up getting divorced once or twice or 3 times because the pace of the life that they're leading is totally incompatible with any kind of family existence. And I remember at Shell how the more senior the manager, the younger their wives were. Simply couldn't handle and hack the abandonment that they had from their spouses who were just never around. So I think that, and yet again, if you think of it from a sort of purely sort of financial perspective, getting divorced is like a really expensive thing to do. In the UK, you lose half your assets in the process. So you could be working really, really hard, and then your wife hates you, and then you lose half your value. It's like, well, maybe you should just pay a little more attention to your wife in the first place, and done that other. So I think that you need to be able to balance all the way through. You need to realize that work is important, And in many cases, work is sort of creates a lot of sense of self-identity. But at the end of the day, work is work. And I think that, your family and your friends are critically important in terms of who you are and how what your identity is. And you got to make sure that all the way through this process, you enjoy it, because, you literally don't know when you might just drop dead. We could be leaving out of the studio here and just get hit by a car. We are so precarious in terms of our existence, and saving up, the fun times for when you're retired or when you're later and things like that, I think it's a really, really bad way of thinking of things. You need to be able to enjoy life all the way through your existence, and just make sure that you create this balance where you have enough time for your family, you have enough time for your spouse, you have enough time for your kids, and you have enough time for your work, but realize at the end of the day, work is work, and it's not the critical thing, which is the sole form of identification of who you are as a human being.
Wonderful. Let's wrap it up at that point. Tristan Fischer, thank you so much for coming in today, taking the time. I mean, we've covered a huge amount, lots of different areas. We've lots more we could have covered. We didn't have time. Some of which I knew, some of which I wasn't aware of. But the bits that I knew were most of the reasons why I've enjoyed working with you over the last couple of years. So thank you very much for coming in today.
Thank you very much, John. That's been great.